Welcome, everyone, this afternoon to Red Talks, Uncommon Voices on Topics That Matter. The aim here really is to showcase our robust faculty talent across disciplines to feature intersectional voices on a range of topics that bear on diversity, equity, and inclusion. The theme of this inaugural Red Talk series is Women's Voices at the Intersection. Now more than ever, women's voices must be amplified. So I'm really excited today that we're going to hear from one of our really influential female voices on campus, Dr. Holly Ferraro. I will introduce her in just a moment, but I want to say a little bit about her topic. She will be speaking on safety. What it means depends on who you are. That goes to the very heart of what it means to create an institution that is inclusively excellent for all. It's really impossible to do that without understanding the various ways in which difference impacts experience. So today, she will be exploring this through the context of race. Nobel laureate Toni Morrison, in one of her more recent books titled The Origin of Others, describes race as genetic imagination. If we think about the public domain, the cultural spaces in which we all inhabit, and the way in which we engage in our daily life activities, these are examples, really, of how race impacts the reality of our experiences. So this is a really timely and relevant topic, and I'm really excited because this idea of safe space in higher ed really is a contested idea. Professor Ferraro is someone whose voice on this campus is very highly regarded. She is an associate professor of management in the Albers School of Business. She's a fellow of the Center for Ethics in Albers. She's also the director of the professional MBA program. Her research examines how people and organizations grow, how they learn, and enhance performance in the face of challenges to deeply held beliefs about who they are. Her most recent research on how racial oppression influences definitions of safety and power is to really think critically about inclusion in workplaces. Dr. Ferraro's research on midlife, mid-career transitions won a cutting-edge award from Academy of Resource Development. She received her Ph.D. in organizational behavior from the University of Maryland, College Park. Before pursuing her doctorate, Dr. Ferraro held technical and managerial positions in industry for over 12 years. So, without further ado, Dr. Ferraro.
Do we define safety similarly? Do you think that you and the person sitting next to you think about safety in the same way? To give you a picture of what we're going to talk about today, I want to take you to the work of some of the most prolific philosophers of our time, TV comedy writers. So, how many of you are familiar with the Big Bang Theory? If you don't know it, it focuses on four scientists, Howard, Leonard, Sheldon, and Rajesh, and their next-door neighbor, Penny. Rajesh is brown and from India. All of the rest of the characters are white citizens of the United States. So Howard embarks on this project that attracts the attention of the United States military. And one day, an officer shows up on his door, but he isn't there. Rajesh is there. The officer gives Rajesh his card and tells him to give it to Howard. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Rajesh goes and shares this story with the other three, and he describes the encounter as terrifying. And Sheldon, the tall white guy in the middle, there in the green shirt, says, "That doesn't sound very scary to me." And Rajesh says, "To a white guy born here, maybe not. But to a brown guy with a lot of syllables in his last name, terrifying." Now, I think what the writer is trying to help us to see is that what could appear benign to one person can be, well, terrifying to someone else. So what I take from this is that safety is not just a function of personality, but of positionality. I like that so much, I'm going to say it again. Safety is not just a function of personality, but positionality. Rajesh is afraid, not just because he's a fearful person, but because he's brown and he's not a US citizen. So let's take this from the realm of fiction into the world of work. I am, as Natasha said, a business school professor, and I'm very interested in how people with stigmatized and marginalized identities navigate work. And so last year I had this great opportunity to moderate a panel. It was diversity professionals here in the Seattle area. And as we were closing, the very last question a young woman asks, how do you make sure that your people of color are safe within the organization? Not just comfortable, not just free from uncomfortable experiences, but safe. So the first panelist says, we use zero tolerance policies, and talked about how when people engage in egregious behavior, they use those policies to either discipline or terminate people. The second person says, hey, look, organizations can only do so much, and so people need to feel free to move from an organization where they don't feel safe to one where they do feel safe and included and valued. The third person doesn't answer the question at all. They throw it to me. And since I'm engaged in some gender equity work at the time, I start to think about freedom from the fear of discrimination. And so I share an answer from that perspective. So we've all talked about safety to some extent, right? But when the event is over, I'm disturbed. I'm thinking about, have we answered this young woman's question? And what are we talking about anyway? What does it mean to be safe? And so I've been spending the last year thinking about this question. What does it mean to be safe? So I'm a researcher, so you know what I did. I started collecting data. With a colleague of mine, we started asking people to describe for us times when they felt unsafe at work. And so far, we've uncovered 5 kinds of safety concerns that I'd like to share with you today. The first one is no safety concerns. These are people who say there's nothing to be afraid of for them at work. An example from our data set is someone who said, I have never been made to feel unsafe at work. The second kind of safety concern is psychological safety. And many of you are familiar with this kind of safety because it's talked about a lot in organizations. You know then that the definition is this shared belief that it's okay to take risks, especially work-related risks. So I can ask questions about the work that we're doing without fear that you're going to humiliate me or make me feel stupid. An example of this from our data set is a person who said, I worked at a place where there was a lot of animosity and tension. And what I felt was that I couldn't express my opinion and I should not meddle in office politics. The third kind of safety that we found was identity, what we're calling identity performance safety. And this is the fear that if I express myself authentically, that I'll be stereotyped. And this is more true for people who are parts of marginalized or stigmatized groups. A good example of this is a young woman who did an internship, and her boss treated her differently and told her she did not think she could do a good job because she was Latina and her second language was English. The fourth kind of safety that we see is physical safety. And this is where people say, I feel that I could suffer bodily injury because, again, of my membership. in a stigmatized or marginalized group. A good example of this from our data set is a young woman who said when she worked as a bartender, she felt unsafe, physically threatened by her male customers because their behavior frequently got out of hand. The fifth kind of safety that we're seeing is what we are calling workplace condition safety, and it's pretty different from the other ones. It's not social, but it's when people say that either the task or the equipment causes them to feel unsafe. And a good example of this was a guy doing landscaping work who said he felt unsafe because there was this heavy equipment, and if they didn't use it properly, they were subject to injury. Now, what are we learning so far about these 5 kinds of safety? The first one, the no safety concerns, only white people wrote about that. No people of color said that they did not feel unsafe at work. Also, that final one, the workplace condition safety, only white people wrote about that. No people of color said that they were worried about the task or the equipment. Where we see people of color and women show up is in this middle range: physical safety, identity performance safety, and psychological safety. So we started trying to think about when could we predict that people might feel these safety concerns. And we thought about the intersection of racial privilege and an organization's stance on racism. So what do we mean by racial privilege? So I'm going to confine my remarks for the purposes of this Red Talk to the United States, where privilege has historically been afforded to white people. And it entails the legal, social, and systematic advantages that are given to white people and withheld from people of color. Now, what does that mean and what doesn't it mean? It doesn't mean that all of the achievements of white people are unearned or that they never suffer hardship. What it does mean is that the resources and power to affect one's outcomes and experience are withheld from people of color, and that results in materially different experiences. The other thing that I'm interested in is this organizational stance on racism. And I'm suggesting that there are 2 stances that are especially important for this area. The first is that an organization can be antagonistic on the topic of racism or toward racism, or they could be agnostic on racism. When an organization is antagonistic to racism, they acknowledge and are aware of the historical way that racism has pervaded our society and how it can seep into our organization's systems. So they are working to make sure that their policies and procedures are trying to keep racism from affecting hiring, work assignments, and the way we do performance evaluations. When an organization is agnostic toward racism, they're really unsure. They say to themselves, I don't know that racism continues to affect the world and if it affects our workplace. And so as a result, if someone brings up a concern about racism, it's often met with disbelief. And often, the person who brings it up, the person of color, is told that, well, maybe it's you. Maybe you're being or doing something that affects your outcomes. So when we think about this, we predict that when an organization is agnostic on racism, the concerns that we'll see for people of color are physical safety concerns and identity performance concerns. In contrast, we think what we'll see with whites is no safety concerns and psychological safety concerns. So why would that be? Because when an organization fails to acknowledge the state-sponsored racism and our historical legacy of racism, then folks of color can't be assured that if they report times when racism is present, the organization will act appropriately and with justice. And that also leaves white people less aware of the kinds of things that their colleagues of color are going through. And so they can be oblivious to the safety concerns that exist within the organization and be free to be more concerned about how they relate to their colleagues. But we predict that when an organization is antagonistic on racism and really working to avoid racism affecting outcomes, we'll see a change in that. And so we'll see these physical safety concerns being less prominent for people of color and giving them the freedom to think about how they interact with their colleagues around work-related tasks. And we'll see whites no longer able to say, I have no concerns about safety, and to have more identity safety performance concerns, thinking about how they show up in the workplace around race. Now, for some of us, I think this has been an uncomfortable 15 minutes. We've been talking about race and racial privilege and racism, and for many people, that's just uncomfortable. Doesn't matter whether you're a person of color or a white person. It just doesn't feel that great. So maybe it will help if I talk a little bit about why I'm okay making you uncomfortable and me uncomfortable, okay? I think there are at least 3 reasons. The first one is what Natasha said earlier. The issue of safety pervades our society. Folks of color are thinking about these things all the time, and there are folks who aren't thinking about it at all. So it's important that we study what it means to be safe. The other reasons are because, one, each of these kinds of safety have different consequences. And to study one and think that we understand what's happening with people is insufficient. So let me talk a little bit about those consequences. When you have no safety concerns, it gives you the opportunity to deny the experience of others. And when organizations seek to create policies and procedures that are more equitable and inclusive, you might resist those because you're not seeing the need for them. So that's a serious consequence. When we have psychological safety, well, that research is rich, and it tells us that we won't learn because we won't ask questions. And as a result, we'll make mistakes, the organization suffers, and individual performance suffers. When it comes to identity performance safety, we also see that people are so busy thinking about how they show up that they can't focus on the tasks that they're doing at work, tasks that they could easily do, but they're spending so much of their cognitive energy worried about, will I be negatively stereotyped? For physical safety, there are so many things that are happening in people's bodies when they feel physically unsafe, from elevated stress hormones that result in gastrointestinal disorders and weakened immune systems. And so there's a lot of problems with folks living under physically unsafe conditions all the time. Now, what can we do about it? That's the other reason why it would make you uncomfortable, is so we can think about what do we do about it. So when folks are feeling no safety concerns, we actually want to disrupt that. We want people to be aware and feel the safety concerns that are present within our environments. When we have psychological safety, again, the literature is rich. When leaders are available and they ask for input, people feel safer. For identity performance safety concerns, I'm convinced that until we stop relying on white cultural standards to make decisions about how people show up at work, we will continue to have identity performance safety concerns. And if you need an example, just think about this. What does it mean to be professional in your workplace? Who created that definition and who benefits from it? Finally, when we think about physical safety, the remedy is for us to have just processes, to treat people with dignity and respect, and ensure that when racial concerns are brought up, that we deal with them with urgency and do it in a way that folks can see that you're making sure you deal with the concerns. So, If you're astute, and I know that you are, you've noticed that there's never a time when safety leaves the organization in this framework. And so I thought that was kind of a bummer way to end this talk, is to say everybody will now feel fear regardless of the conditions. I don't feel that great. So I want to, if you're feeling the way I was feeling when I finished this, I thought, where's the hope? And I thought about Dr. Martin Luther King. Great place to go when you need hope. And what he says is fear is a compelling creative force. That what we have accomplished as human beings is often done because we want to leave situations that we dread. And he distinguishes between fear that is motivating and takes us to creative action and fear that is paralyzing and poisonous. And he encourages us to harness our fear through using our courage and love, and not this weepy, sentimental kind of love, but love that encourages folks to change so that we can live together in peace. So I'm going to ask you, what are you afraid of? What are your safety concerns today? I know they're not mine. We've already established that fear is a function of positionality. But whatever you're afraid of, I'd like to ask you, is it poisoning you? Or are you becoming creative and thinking about how you can be courageous and exhibit the kind of love that changes our organization? Thank you.